Greg Parker, 42, had always trusted two people without question: his wife, Melissa, and his best friend and business partner, David Walsh. Together, they'd built a small but thriving construction firm in Austin, the kind of local company with deep ties and loyal crews. For 15 years, David handled the books while Greg handled the jobs. It worked, or so he thought. But lately, Greg couldn't shake the feeling something was off. David, 43, was acting cagey, taking calls in the hallway, closing his laptop whenever Greg walked in. And Melissa, 40, had gone from warm and steady to distant, always busy with some charity event or staying late at the local art gallery where she volunteered. Greg wanted to believe the stories. He really did. But doubt was an itch that wouldn't leave him alone. One Tuesday night, Greg sat in his truck in the driveway longer than usual, watching the glow of their living room lamp through the curtains. He could see shadows moving. Two figures, too close for comfort. His gut twisted. He'd been out late meeting a subcontractor, but David knew his schedule. He was the only one who did. Greg slipped the spare key into the lock as quietly as he could. He pushed the door open an inch at a time, holding his breath. The muffled sound of a laugh, Melissa's laugh, hit him like a slap. Then David's voice, low and too familiar. Greg's heart hammered as he stepped into the hallway. He could see them now. Melissa perched on the arm of the couch, David standing between her knees, his hand resting on her thigh like he'd done it 100 times before. Greg didn't say a word. Not yet. He just watched, hidden in the shadows, while 1,000 memories rewrote themselves in his head. The weekends David spent at their lake house. The late-night calls from Melissa, saying she was checking books with David when Greg was on the road. The sudden missing invoices David always said he'd handle. It all snapped into place like a cruel puzzle. Melissa leaned forward, pressing her lips to David's. Greg's stomach turned, but he didn't move. He needed more than this. He needed the truth that would bury them both. When he finally stepped into the light, his voice was calm. Too calm. "Don't stop on my account," Greg said. Melissa froze. David spun around, face pale. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Greg smiled. "Cold. Sharp. Guess we need to talk about the books, huh, partner?" For a second, no one moved. Melissa's eyes darted between Greg and David like a cornered animal's. Wide, wet, searching for some way out that wasn't there. David's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a man who'd been caught with blood on his hands and still thought he could talk his way out of it. Greg didn't blink. He stepped closer, slow, each footstep echoing off the hardwood like a warning shot. "Greg, wait," David began, but Greg cut him off with a laugh that sounded nothing like the man Melissa married. "Wait? For what? An explanation? Some story about how this just happened?" He let out a low whistle, nodding at David's hand still hovering too close to Melissa's thigh. "You want to move that? Or do you want to break it first?" David yanked his hand back like he'd been burned. Melissa stood up, so quickly she almost toppled the side table. She reached for Greg's arm, the same arm she'd kissed before he left for work that morning. "Greg, please, it's not what you think," she started, but her voice broke on the lie. Greg barked a laugh. "Not what I think." "Really? Then tell me, Melissa, what am I thinking? Because right now, I'm thinking my wife is screwing my best friend behind my back while he steals from our company." He turned his gaze to David. "How close am I?" David's jaw clenched, but the guilt was written all over his face. Greg saw the panic in his eyes, the frantic calculations, the scramble for an exit strategy. For years Greg had trusted that look, thinking it meant David was solving problems. Now he knew better. That look meant David was covering his tracks. "You don't understand," David tried again. Greg stepped, so close their chests almost touched. His voice dropped to a whisper that made David flinch. "Then make me understand. Make me understand the missing invoices, the fake accounts. Make me understand why my wife smells like your cologne." Melissa gasped, but David didn't even deny it. He just swallowed, eyes darting toward the door like maybe he could outrun the truth. Greg backed up, giving them just enough space to breathe, but not enough to hope. "I'm not calling the cops," Greg said, voice like ice. "Not yet, because I want to know exactly how deep this goes. And you too. You're going to help me." Melissa's lip quivered. "Greg," he raised a finger, silencing her. "No, you don't talk. Not until I say." For the first time in years, Greg felt like he was holding the cards. and he planned to play every one of them perfectly. David backed up until his calves hit the edge of the coffee table, like he'd forgotten the layout of Greg's living room. The same room where they'd once toasted their first big contract, where David had grinned wide and promised loyalty thicker than blood. Now his grin was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear that Greg savored for half a second too long. Melissa shifted beside him, tugging at the hem of her silk blouse like she could hide the truth in the fabric. Greg's eyes fell to her hands, the wedding band still there, still shining under the lamplight. The sight made his chest twist so tight he had to swallow it down. "Sit," Greg said, pointing at the couch. Neither of them moved. He let the silence stretch, the threat hanging invisible in the air. "I said sit." They obeyed like scolded children, perched side by side, but not touching now. That betrayal, so casual moments ago, already looked rotten under the light of Greg's fury. He grabbed David's laptop bag from the floor where it lay open, the one he'd seen too many times to count, always stuffed with receipts and invoices. Greg unzipped it, dumped everything onto the coffee table. Folders, thumb drives, a spiral notebook crammed with half-legible notes. "What is this?" Greg asked, voice low but shaking at the edges. "Tell me exactly what I'm looking for, David, or I swear you'll wish I just called the police." David licked his lips, throat bobbing. "Greg, you have to believe me. It wasn't about the money. Not at first. I just needed a little extra to cover the tax penalties. It got out of hand." Greg slammed his palm on the table, rattling the glass candle holder next to the notebooks. Melissa flinched so hard she nearly fell off the couch. "Don't lie to me." Greg's voice cracked, fury boiling over. "You've been funneling money for months. You think I didn't notice the missing invoices? The duplicate orders? The petty cash that never added up? You used my trust like a personal ATM." David shrank into the cushions, eyes darting toward Melissa for backup. But she just sat frozen, mascara smudged, mouth half open. Greg leaned in, close enough to see the sweat bead on David's forehead. "You were gonna run, weren't you? Take her with you. My money, my wife, my life." The truth hovered there, thick and poisonous. David didn't answer. He didn't have to. Greg could see it in the way his eyes fell to the carpet. And that was all Greg needed. He straightened up, his breath ragged but steady. He'd been betrayed once. He wouldn't be outplayed again. Greg stood over them, arms crossed, pulse thudding so loud he wondered if they could hear it. For a moment, he almost laughed. Not because any of this was funny, but because of how perfectly they'd underestimated him. The loyal husband, the trusting partner, the man who never looked too close at the books because David said, "I've got it, buddy. Don't worry." Well, Greg was worrying now, and so were they. "Here's what's going to happen," Greg said, voice calm again, deadly smooth. "You're both going to sit there and explain everything. Every cent, every fake expense, every weekend getaway you paid for with my money while you told me you were at a tax seminar." Melissa winced. "Greg, please, I didn't know. Save it." Greg's eyes cut to her so fast she swallowed the rest of the lie. He turned back to David. "And you're going to open that laptop, log in, and show me the hidden accounts." David's fingers twitched on his knee. "Greg, if we could just..." "Do it," Greg snapped. David leaned forward, hands trembling as he opened the laptop. The familiar chime of it booting up felt surreal in the silence. Greg moved behind the couch, hovering over David's shoulder like a warden. He watched the password field appear, watched David hesitate for half a second too long. "Don't even think about playing smart," Greg warned. "You try to wipe something, you better hope the cops get here before I do." David flinched, then typed. Lines of spreadsheets bloomed on the screen. Petty cash reports, payroll files, invoices Greg had signed without thinking twice. And there, tucked under a folder named Quarterly Forecasts, were the real books, the ones that told the truth. Greg's eyes scanned the numbers. Offshore transfers, fake vendor names, a personal expense column disguised as equipment maintenance. He felt his throat tighten, rage and cold betrayal mixing like acid in his chest. "You were going to drain me dry," Greg whispered. "Run off together like some cheap heist movie." Melissa buried her face in her hands, but Greg didn't care if she cried now. Let her drown in it. He reached over, clicked on the last file, an itinerary. Plane tickets booked for 2, leaving next week. Destination, Belize. Belize. Greg laughed, humorless. Sunshine, mojitos, and my retirement fund. Huh. David didn't answer. Melissa didn't look up. Greg's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to breathe. He couldn't explode. Not yet. Because if they thought this was the end of his story, they hadn't learned a damn thing about Greg Parker. Greg took a step back from the couch, letting the glow of the laptop screen flicker across David's guilty face. He felt the old hardwood floor under his feet, steadying him while his entire world tilted sideways. Part of him wanted to grab David by the collar, drag him into the yard, and finish this with his fists. But another part, the colder, sharper part, wanted something better, something permanent. He closed the laptop with a click that made both of them jump. Then he leaned over the back of the couch, voice low but clear. "You really thought you'd just fly off and live it up on my dime?" Greg asked, eyes locked on David. "Did you think I'd roll over? That I'd never find out?" David's mouth opened, then closed. Beside him, Melissa wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, but Greg could see there were no real tears. Just regret for getting caught. "Greg, you have to understand," she whispered. "It wasn't. It just happened. David, he said we needed the money. He said you'd never." "Don't." Greg cut her off. "Don't pin this all on him. You were there. You were in on it." Melissa's lips trembled, but she didn't deny it this time. That hurt worse than any punch Greg had ever taken. He turned to David, almost amused now by the pathetic fear in the man's eyes. "How long, Dave? 5 months? A year?" David swallowed. 18 months. Greg laughed, sharp and empty. 18 months. While I was out lining up contracts, you were lining up fake invoices and sleeping with my wife." Silence. The only sound was the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Greg let it hang there, heavy. Then he stepped around the couch and crouched in front of them, so close he could smell David's nervous sweat. "Here's what's going to happen," Greg said, voice so calm it made Melissa flinch. "You're going to transfer every cent back where it belongs. Every offshore account. Every penny you tucked away for pina coladas in Belize." David started to protest, but Greg raised a finger. "You're going to do it tonight. And once that's done, you're going to sign over your half of the company. Free and clear. No lawyers. No buyout. You walk away with nothing." He turned to Melissa, his gaze slicing through her. "And you're going to leave this house tonight. No spousal anything. No share of my company. You chose your side." Melissa's face crumpled. "Greg, please." Greg stood, towering over them. "You made this bed. Lie in it. Just not under my roof." He watched them squirm, the truth finally sinking in. They'd planned to rob him blind. Now he'd watched them lose everything. And this was only the beginning. Greg could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all three of them. The living room that once held Christmas mornings and quiet movie nights now felt like a crime scene. And he was both victim and judge. He looked down at David, then at Melissa, then at the heap of papers still scattered across the coffee table like the broken pieces of his trust. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a dry rasp. "Greg, listen, man, let's be reasonable. We can work something out. You can't just..." Greg barked a laugh, short and humorless. "Reasonable? David, you just stole nearly $500,000 and plan to vanish with my wife. You think you're in a position to bargain?" David dropped his eyes. Melissa shifted on the couch, hands clenched in her lap, the perfect image of shame, but Greg knew her too well to believe it. She was already calculating her next move. The next sob story, she'd sell someone new. "You're going to wire it all back," Greg repeated, voice low but iron hard. "Tonight. Or tomorrow morning the cops get all this." He kicked the laptop bag with his boot, making David jump. "And you know what happens to white-collar thieves, Dave. You won't be sipping cocktails on a beach. You'll be explaining fake invoices to a cellmate." David's shoulders sagged in defeat. Greg almost pitted him. Almost. Melissa's voice was a whisper now, frayed and desperate. "Where am I supposed to go, Greg? Please, you can't just..." Greg stared at her. This woman who'd once stood at an altar and promised forever, who'd worn his ring and called him her world, who'd lied with the same mouth that now begged for mercy. "You should have thought about that when you were booking flights to Belize," he said coldly. "Pack a bag. You're out tonight." Melissa's eyes filled with real tears now. Ugly, splotchy tears that left black streaks of mascara down her cheeks. Greg felt nothing. He turned back to David, flicking his chin at the laptop. You better get moving. Money first. You got until sunrise. He watched them both squirm under the weight of it. The sudden reality that their dream heist had turned into a nightmare. Greg should have felt broken, but all he felt was clear, sharper than he'd ever been. As he stepped away to grab his phone, Greg's mind raced. This was just part one. Money was just the beginning. David and Melissa had planned to burn his life to the ground. But Greg Parker had other plans. And tomorrow, the whole town would know exactly who they were. Greg stood in the hallway, phone in hand, listening to the low murmur of David and Melissa behind him. He could hear the tap of David's fingers on the laptop keys, the frantic clicking of a man trying to reverse engineer months of theft in a single night. It gave Greg a cold satisfaction, like watching termites scatter when you crack open rotting wood. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one he needed. Mark Sullivan, CPA. Mark had been Greg's accountant before David ever came along. A steady, cautious man, one Greg should have trusted more. Greg hit call. Mark, it's Greg Parker. Sorry to wake you, but I need you to come by my place first thing tomorrow. Bring everything you've got on Walsh and the company accounts. We're tearing it all apart. Mark's sleepy confusion turned sharp fast. Greg, what's going on? Greg's eyes flicked back to the living room. David hunched over the laptop, Melissa silent beside him, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear. Just a little spring cleaning, Greg said. See you at 7. He hung up without waiting for a reply. For the first time in hours, he felt the tight band in his chest ease just a fraction. There'd be no sweeping this under the rug. No hush money. He'd make sure the whole truth came out, no matter how many heads rolled with it. When he stepped back into the living room, David looked up, pale and sweating. Greg, I'm wiring it all back. But the offshore account, it'll take a few days to clear. Greg raised an eyebrow. You think I care about excuses now? Get moving. Every dollar. I don't care if you have to call your bank manager at midnight. Melissa spoke up for the first time in minutes, her voice small. Greg, where am I supposed to sleep tonight? Please, can I stay until morning? Greg let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Where did you plan to sleep in Belize, Melissa? David's hotel room, right? Go there. Or find a motel. You won't do it on my couch. She flinched like he'd struck her. Greg almost wished he could feel bad for her, but he'd buried that part of himself when he'd seen her kissing his best friend in his own living room. He stepped closer, dropped his voice to a whisper only she could hear. Pack your bags. And when you leave the house key on the counter. If you take anything that's mine, you'll regret it. Melissa stared at him, eyes wide, breath shaking, but she knew he meant every word. Greg turned away, his mind racing ahead. The money was just the beginning. Tomorrow, the real show would start, and David and Melissa would learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything they tried to steal. Greg watched from the hallway as Melissa trudged up the stairs, her footsteps slow, defeated. She looked smaller somehow. The same woman who used to light up every room now seemed like a ghost fading under the hallway light. Part of Greg expected to feel something. Sorrow, pity, the echo of love. But all he felt was a bitter, hollow relief. She'd chosen this, not him. Back in the living room, David was hunched over the laptop, shoulders curled in like he could disappear behind the screen. Greg stood over him, arms crossed, making sure there was no sudden trick, no quick delete, no convenient system crash. Not this time. You know, Greg said, his voice low but clear, I used to think you were the smartest guy I knew. The one who'd keep us both out of the IRS's crosshairs, build us up big enough to retire before 50. David didn't look up. He just kept tapping at the keyboard. Each key clacked a desperate apology he didn't have the guts to say out loud. Greg went on, the words sharp but steady. I thought I owed you everything. Turns out you were bleeding me dry the whole time. David's fingers froze. He opened his mouth to speak, but Greg shook his head. Don't. Just do the transfer. From upstairs came the muffled sound of drawers opening and closing. Melissa, packing her life into a suitcase Greg had bought her for their anniversary trip to Napa Valley. He almost laughed at the cruel symmetry of it. He turned back to David. After tonight, you're going to tell your wife. David's head snapped up, eyes wide. What? Greg, no, Jessica can't. Oh, Jessica can. She should know who she married. Greg leaned closer, voice calm as a blade. You think you two can rebuild your marriage on a lie after what you did here? Not on my watch. If you don't tell her, I will. David's face went pale. "You're gonna ruin me." Greg gave him a cold half-smile. "You did that yourself, pal." A suitcase thudded on the stairs. Melissa appeared at the bottom step, clutching a duffel bag and her purse. Her eyes flicked to Greg, hoping for mercy one last time. She found none. "Keys?" Greg asked. She dug in her purse with shaking hands and set them on the entryway table. The soft jingle as they landed felt final, the last piece of their life together clattering to an end. Greg stepped aside, watching her brush past him without a word. He didn't turn when the door closed behind her. He looked back at David, who sat small and cornered on the couch, the laptop screen reflecting a zeroing bank balance. Greg exhaled. This was justice, and it was only getting started. The door's soft click echoed in the silence, a final note in a song Greg never wanted to hear again. He didn't move for a moment, just stood there listening to the faint rumble of Melissa's car starting outside. No slam of the door, no final scream, just the quiet slip of a life leaving his behind. Good. He didn't need drama. He needed closure. Greg turned back to David, who was still hunched over the laptop, shoulders shaking. Whether from stress or shame, Greg couldn't tell, and he didn't care. "How much is left?" Greg asked, his voice so calm it startled even him. David's fingers hovered over the trackpad. "I got most of it. Some of the offshore stuff is stuck in the wire queue. It'll clear by morning." Greg pulled out his phone and tapped his bank app, eyes flicking from the screen to David's face. The numbers were coming back, slowly, but they were coming. He forced a breath through his nose, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. He remembered when he'd first trusted David with the books. When David had showed up in his tiny starter office with an armful of binders and a grin that promised he'd handle the boring money stuff so Greg could chase the bigger dreams. Now Greg wondered how much of that grin had been real and how much had been calculating his worth. "You know what the worst part is?" Greg asked, dropping into the armchair opposite David. "You didn't just steal my money. You stole my time, my faith." David rubbed a hand over his face, eyes red, voice raw. "Greg, I swear to you, I never planned for it to go this far. Melissa, she..." Greg's laugh cut him off like a blade. "Melissa? She didn't cook the books, David. She just jumped on the escape plan when you dangled it in front of her." David's mouth opened and shut like a fish on dry land. Greg leaned in, elbows on his knees. "You thought you'd take my life, my money, my marriage, and walk away free? You're gonna learn the same thing Melissa just did. Actions cost." He nodded toward the laptop. "Finish the transfer. Then you're gonna draft your resignation from the company. Effective immediately. I want it ready before you leave." David's shoulders slumped. "Greg, come on. I've got a family. And you should have thought about them before you made me your personal ATM." Greg snapped, his voice cutting the air like a whip. "Your wife will find out. Maybe she'll forgive you. Maybe she won't. But this company, it's done with you." David's breathing hitched. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then started moving again, defeated, mechanical. The quiet click of keys was the only sound in the room. Greg leaned back, arms folded. He wasn't done yet. Not even close. Greg watched the cursor blink on David's resignation draft. That little line of code now felt like a nail sealing a coffin. It should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like staring into a crater where his life used to be. He wondered if that would ever fade, or if betrayal like this just left scars that never really healed. David's voice broke the silence, low and brittle. "Greg, what am I supposed to tell Jessica? The kids?" Greg stared at him for a long second, then shook his head. "You're going to tell them the truth. Every word. You owe them that much, if you ever want to look them in the eye again." David's shoulders hunched further. He looked like a man already halfway underground. Greg stood and began pacing the living room, each step echoing off the hardwood like a metronome, counting down to something final. His mind spun through everything ahead. The paperwork, the banks, the accountants who'd combed through every suspicious dollar until they were sure no more secrets were buried. And Greg would stand at the center of it, patient and merciless. "Here's what's next," Greg said, stopping behind David's chair. "You finish that letter. You send the wire transfer confirmation to Mark Sullivan by morning. Then you disappear from my company, my life, everything." David nodded weakly, but Greg wasn't finished. He leaned down, voice so quiet it made David flinch. "If I find out you touched one more cent, David, I will press charges. And I'll make sure your next office is a cell. You understand. David's head bobbed, the only answer he could manage. Greg's eyes flicked to the clock. Past midnight. He realized how numb he felt, how far he was from the man who had once invited David over for Sunday barbecues. That man was gone, maybe for good. He walked to the window, looking out at the empty driveway where Melissa's car had disappeared into the night. He pictured her sitting in some cheap motel right now, crying into cold hands, wondering where it all went wrong. He should feel something, pity, regret, but instead he felt lighter than he had in years. Behind him, David hit save on the resignation letter. The quiet chime of the laptop sealed it all. Greg turned, his eyes cold but clear. Email it. Now. David obeyed, fingers trembling as he typed. The whoosh of the sent message cut through the heavy air like a gunshot. Greg nodded once, final. Good. Now get out. David rose, shoulders slumped, laptop hugged to his chest like a useless shield. He paused at the door, eyes flicking back, maybe hoping Greg would soften at the last second. Greg said nothing. He just held his stare until David stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him. Greg exhaled, alone now but free, or maybe just at the beginning of what came next. The door shut behind David like the final beat of a drum Greg never wanted to hear again. For a moment, the house fell into an eerie, unfamiliar quiet. No voices, no lies dripping off honeyed tongues, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the hallway clock. Greg let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for hours. He ran a hand through his hair and sank onto the couch. The same couch where David and Melissa had whispered their betrayal like it was nothing more than a harmless secret. The leather felt cold under him. He remembered the nights he'd dozed off here after long work days. Melissa curled against his side, David dropping by with a six-pack and a grin. Greg let the memory roll through him, then forced it out. He wouldn't let ghosts live here anymore. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him back. It was Mark, the accountant, replying to the midnight voicemail. Understood. I'll get the paperwork lined up first thing. Proud of you for how you're handling this. Greg almost laughed. Proud? He didn't feel proud. He felt raw, emptied out. But he typed back thanks, see you at 7, and set the phone down without waiting for the bubbles of Mark's next reply. He got up, moving on autopilot through the house, past the family photos on the wall, all of them suddenly feeling staged, plastic smiles wrapped around secrets he hadn't been allowed to see. He pulled each frame down, one by one, laying them flat on the dining table. Maybe he'd keep them for proof one day, or maybe he'd toss them in the trash come morning. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water. His hands trembled a little, the adrenaline crash beginning to settle in. He drank, staring through the window at the dark yard beyond. He could almost hear Melissa's voice echoing in the hall. Laughter over wine, sweet nothings that now meant absolutely nothing. Greg leaned against the counter, the taste of cold water turning metallic on his tongue. He knew tonight was just the start. Tomorrow, there'd be more fallout. Rumors would spread. David would scramble to keep his family together. Melissa, well, who knew what story she'd spin? But Greg knew one thing. He'd rebuild. He'd do it without them. Without liars. Without thieves. Just him, and the pieces that were still his. Somewhere deep down, a spark of resolve flickered. It was fragile, but alive. And as Greg stared at his own reflection in the kitchen window, he promised himself he'd make that spark a wildfire. Greg didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. He sat at the dining table under the soft hum of the overhead light, a half-empty mug of coffee growing cold beside him. All around him, the photo frames lay face down like silent witnesses to everything he'd ignored for too long. The house felt too big now. Every creak of the floorboards an echo of what used to be a family home. But instead of crushing him, the emptiness gave Greg something he hadn't felt in years. Room to breathe. At 6:30, the headlights of Mark's car swept across the front windows. Greg stood, rolled the tension out of his shoulders, and opened the door before Mark even knocked. Mark Sullivan, short and sturdy in an old brown coat, looked at Greg with the careful eyes of a man who'd seen too many wrecked finances and shattered friendships. He stepped inside without a word, setting his worn leather briefcase on the table next to the upside-down frames. Greg, he said gently, I brought everything you asked for. Bank statements, contracts, backups of the offshore reports. Greg nodded. Good. We're burning it all down to the foundation. I want David's trail tracked backward and forward. If he moved $1 under my nose, I want to know when, where, and who helped. Mark opened his briefcase, pulling out file after file. It's going to be a mess, but we'll clean it. You did the hard part already, Greg. A lot of men would have ignored it until they were broke and divorced. Greg let out a low laugh. I am divorced. We're as close as it gets. Mark glanced at the scattered photos, then back at Greg's drawn face. Then good riddance. For the first time, Greg cracked a real smile, small but real. They spent the next hour hunched over paperwork, laptop screens glowing with numbers that used to be secrets. Greg asked questions Mark hadn't expected him to ask. Who signed what? When did the money start shifting? How deep did David's betrayal go? And every answer Mark gave just steeled Greg's resolve more. At 8, Greg stood and poured them both fresh coffee. He looked around the mess, files, folders, coffee rings on the wood, and felt a strange rush of pride. He hadn't chosen this wreckage, but it was his now, his to rebuild, his to control. Mark leaned back, flipping through one last ledger. You ready for the next step? Greg stared out the window at the pale dawn breaking over the yard. Melissa was gone. David was gone. His so-called best friend had tried to bury him, but Greg wasn't the one who ended up 6 feet under. He turned to Mark, eyes sharp and alive for the first time in years. Yeah, I'm ready. Let's bury them instead. Greg didn't bother with small talk as he and Mark combed through every statement line by line. He wanted to see it all. The fake vendor invoices David had slipped in, the quiet transfers to accounts Greg never approved, the subtle overlaps where Melissa's credit card suddenly matched up with weekend trips she'd taken with friends. With each page, Greg felt the anger simmering, but it didn't burn wild like before. Now it felt focused, a blade rather than a bonfire. Mark set down one folder and rubbed his temple. You know, this level of detail, David must have been at it for years. Some of these transactions are tiny, easy to miss. Greg traced his finger over a highlighted row, a catering expense that never happened, signed by David. He knew I trusted him, trusted both of them. That's why they got sloppy. Mark shot him a look. You know you can take this straight to the DA, right? Fraud this size? Jail time's real. Greg shook his head. Not yet. First, I want to make sure they know exactly what they threw away. Mark raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He flipped open another folder. Okay then, let's map the timeline. Figure out when they crossed the line from temptation to full betrayal. Greg sat back, running a hand over his jaw. He could see it all now. The missed dinners because David had to work late. Melissa's sudden new clothes she brushed off as discount finds. The secret glances he'd written off as inside jokes. God, he thought, how blind was I? Mark's pen tapped the table. Hey, don't blame yourself too much. You trusted your wife, your business partner. That's normal, Greg. Greg met his eyes. Yeah, and it's the last time I make that mistake. They worked until noon, stopping only when Greg's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Melissa. Greg stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen. He pictured her, somewhere out there, maybe holed up in a motel lobby with cheap coffee and excuses ready to drip from her tongue. Mark leaned over. Gonna answer? Greg's lips twisted into a humorless smirk. Not yet. He set the phone face down. If she wanted a conversation, she'd get one. On his terms. Greg pushed his chair back, standing to stretch. I'm hungry. You hungry? Mark grinned tiredly. I could eat. Greg grabbed his keys. Good. Lunch is on me. And when we get back, we finish this. Every lie, every dollar, every piece of them stripped bare. As they stepped out into the crisp air, Greg felt it for the first time. Freedom. Heavy with dust and ashes, but freedom all the same. The diner Greg chose wasn't fancy, just a corner joint with worn vinyl booze and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. But today, it felt like neutral ground. No echoes of Melissa's laughter here. No memories of David leaning over his laptop with false promises. Just a place where Greg could breathe and plan. He and Mark slid into a booth by the window. A waitress with tired eyes poured their coffee without asking. Greg watched the steam swirl above the chipped mug, feeling the bitter warmth seep through his cold fingers. Mark pulled out his notepad, even here, because Mark never really stopped working. So, what's the plan when she shows up banging on your door? Greg stirred sugar into his coffee, the spoon clinking against porcelain. She won't. Not yet. She'll circle. Try to find the version of me she used to twist around her finger. But that version's dead. Mark chuckled. Almost feel bad for her. Almost. Greg didn't smile. He stared out the window at the parking lot, where a mother wrestled a toddler into a car seat. Once, that had been the future he pictured with Melissa. Family trips, Saturday soccer games, growing old side by side. He could still see it if he closed his eyes too long. So he didn't. Once the money's secured, Greg said, dragging himself back, "We go public." Mark frowned. Public how? Greg met his eyes. The clients, the partners, they'll find out the truth. David's name off every file. Melissa's involvement too, if she tries to spin this as anything but what it is. No more secrets. Mark tapped his pen. They'll talk, you know. Neighbors, mutual friends. This town loves a scandal. Greg smirked into his mug. Good. Let them talk. Let them know I didn't just roll over. Mark leaned back, studying him. You're not the same guy I signed contracts with 5 years ago. You know that? Greg tilted his head. Is that a compliment or a warning? Bit of both, Mark said, grinning. The waitress dropped off plates of greasy eggs and toast. Greg ate slowly, tasting every bite like it might ground him to this moment, this second chance. When they finished, they walked back to the truck under a sky that threatened rain. Greg paused before getting in, looking at the horizon. Melissa's text buzzed again, this time just one word. Please. He slid the phone into his pocket without reading more. Let her wait. As he climbed in the truck, Greg turned to Mark, voice steady as steel. Time to finish it. No mercy. And as the diner faded behind them, Greg felt ready, not just to survive, but to win. The diner Greg chose wasn't fancy, just a corner joint with worn vinyl booze and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. But today, it felt like neutral ground. No echoes of Melissa's laughter here. No memories of David leaning over his laptop with false promises. Just a place where Greg could breathe and plan. He and Mark slid into a booth by the window. A waitress with tired eyes poured their coffee without asking. Greg watched the steam swirl above the chipped mug, feeling the bitter warmth seep through his cold fingers. Mark pulled out his notepad, even here, because Mark never really stopped working. So, what's the plan when she shows up banging on your door? Greg stirred sugar into his coffee, the spoon clinking against porcelain. She won't. Not yet. She'll circle, try to find the version of me she used to twist around her finger. But that version's dead. Mark chuckled. I almost feel bad for her. Almost. Greg didn't smile. He stared out the window at the parking lot, where a mother wrestled a toddler into a car seat. Once, that had been the future he pictured with Melissa. Family trips, Saturday soccer games, growing old side by side. He could still see it if he closed his eyes too long. So he didn't. Once the money's secured, Greg said, dragging himself back, we go public. Mark frowned. Public how? Greg met his eyes. The clients, the partners, they'll find out the truth. David's name off every file. Melissa's involvement too, if she tries to spin this as anything but what it is. No more secrets. Mark tapped his pen. They'll talk, you know. Neighbors, mutual friends. This town loves a scandal. Greg smirked into his mug. Good. Let them talk. Let them know I didn't just roll over. Mark leaned back, studying him. You're not the same guy I signed contract with 5 years ago. You know that? Greg tilted his head. Is that a compliment or a warning? Bit of both, Mark said, grinning. The waitress dropped off plates of greasy eggs and toast. Greg ate slowly, tasting every bite like it might ground him to this moment, this second chance. When they finished, they walked back to the truck under a sky that threatened rain. Greg paused before getting in, looking at the horizon. Melissa's text buzzed again, this time just one word. Please. He slid the phone into his pocket without reading more. Let her wait. As he climbed into the truck, Greg turned to Mark, voice steady as steel. Time to finish it. No mercy. And as the diner faded behind them, Greg felt ready, not just to survive, but to win. Greg stared at the dark screen of his phone, Melissa's name still lingering in the call history like a ghost that refused to fade. He placed it face down on the pile of folders, a symbolic coffin for everything she and David had buried here without his knowing. Mark broke the silence first, flipping his notebook shut with a satisfying snap. So the statement's out. The wire's locked. Melissa knows you're done. What's next? Greg leaned back, letting the chair creak under his weight. For the first time, the exhaustion pressed in. Not the panic kind, but the good kind that comes after you finally finish digging out a rotten root. Next, I show up tomorrow. To the office. To the clients. I look every one of them in the eye and tell them I'm not going anywhere. Mark gave him a crooked grin. You think she'll show up there? Or David? Greg's laugh was sharp. If they do, they'll be guests. And the security guard's going to have clear instructions. He pictured Melissa storming through the glass doors, some half-baked apology on her tongue. He pictured David trailing behind her, hollow-eyed and humiliated. The vision didn't hurt him anymore. It almost entertained him. He rose and crossed to the window. The rain outside had turned steady, drumming against the glass like a cleansing ritual. He wondered where she was now. Maybe parked on some side street, staring at the same storm, realizing that every lie she'd told had finally come home to drown her. Mark stood too, gathering the papers. You know, if you wanted to press charges, you'd have a pretty solid case. Greg looked at him over his shoulder. You really want to sit through that circus? Months of lawyers? Her crocodile tears on some witness stand. Mark shrugged. I'd watch it. Greg barked a real laugh for the first time that day. Nah, she's not worth another second of my time. David either. He turned back to the window, the streetlights flickering on one by one. For years he'd believed his life was a fortress built on trust. Tonight, he saw the cracks for what they were, not signs of weakness, but reminders of how strong the foundation could be once the rot was scraped away. His phone buzzed again, this time from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. A simple message. Heard about what happened. Proud of you. Call me if you want to grab a drink. Greg felt his throat tighten. He turned to Mark, voice low but sure. You know what I want right now? A real drink. With someone who's actually worth the time. Mark's grin widened. First round's on me. Greg grabbed his coat from the chair, flicked off the lights, and stepped into the rain that had already started washing his past away. The bar Greg picked wasn't fancy. A low-lit corner spot 2 blocks from his first ever office. The neon sign hummed above the door, half the letters flickering like a heartbeat that refused to die out. Fitting, he thought. He pushed through the door with Mark at his side, the warm buzz of muted laughter and clinking glasses greeting him like an old friend. They settled at the far end, away from the door. Greg ordered a whiskey neat. No more watered-down beers at fake happy hours with David. No polite clinks of wine glasses at dinner with Melissa pretending they were something they weren't. Just the good stuff, burning clean all the way down. Mark lifted his glass too. To freedom, he said. Greg smirked, but his eyes stayed distant. To freedom, he echoed, knocking the rim of his glass against Mark's. They drank in silence at first. Around them, life carried on. A couple fighting in low whispers near the dartboard. A group of college kids shouting over a pool game. Greg watched them, wondering how many stories here were brewing their own storms. Secrets thick as fog waiting to break. Mark broke the quiet. You thought about what you'll do next? When this settles. Greg's eyes stayed on the amber swirl in his glass. Yeah, I'll rebuild. Different this time. Smarter. And alone for a while. Until I know who deserves a seat at the table. Mark nodded like he'd expected that answer. And her. Think she'll crawl back again. Greg's jaw tightened. He pictured Melissa standing in the rain outside his front door, mascara streaked, excuses ready. He almost felt pity. Almost. She'll try, he said, but she won't find me. His phone buzzed again on the bar. Another number he didn't recognize. He flipped it face down without looking. Mark raised an eyebrow. Greg just shrugged. Not tonight. They ordered another round. The edge of the whiskey softening the hard corners of Greg's mind. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the pressure in his chest loosen. He could breathe. He could imagine the weeks ahead. Honest work, quiet mornings, no second-guessing every word, every glance. He leaned back on the warm bar stool and let the noise wash over him. This place, these people, none of them knew him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Mark tapped his glass against Greg's again, lower this time, like a promise. To new foundations. Greg held the moment, feeling the weight of what he'd lost and the lightness of what he'd gained in its place. He clinked his glass back, to never being that blind again. Outside, the rain still fell, but Greg knew now it was just weather, and storms always passed. Greg stepped out of the bar with Mark close behind, the night air damp and alive with the lingering drizzle. Streetlights flickered on wet pavement, reflections stretching like veins through the city. He suddenly felt connected to again. Not trapped by it, not fooled by it, but rooted in it on his own terms. He paused under the awning, tipping his head back to feel the rain cool his skin. Mark laughed and ducked deeper under the overhang, but Greg didn't mind. For years he'd hidden from storms, from uncomfortable truths, from signs he didn't want to see. Now he let it hit him straight on. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, half expecting another text from Melissa, but it was his lawyer this time. David's agreed to sign everything over. He knows he's cornered. It's done. Greg let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It's done. Not just the betrayal, but the constant second-guessing, the knots in his gut every time Melissa said she was working late, the excuses that David fed him with that practiced grin. The lies stopped here. He made sure of it. Beside him, Mark clapped him on the shoulder. "So, boss, what now?" Greg turned toward the street, the city humming around him. He thought about the old house, the rooms that felt like graveyards for broken promises. He'd sell it, start fresh, maybe somewhere smaller, quieter, a place where trust wouldn't feel like an open wound, but something he could learn to build again, brick by honest brick. "Now," Greg said, grinning despite the ache behind his eyes. "Now I go home. I sleep for the first time in months, and tomorrow, I show up at that office and remind every single client why they believed in me, not David." Mark gave a low whistle. "Reckon she'll try to show up again?" Greg's grin turned into a small, satisfied smile. "Let her." This time, the door stays shut. He pulled his keys from his pocket. No shaking hands this time. No more doubts. Just a man walking back to his car in the rain, lighter than he'd been in years. Before he slid behind the wheel, he turned back to Mark. "Hey, you ever want out of the numbers game? You know there'll always be a place for you." Mark grinned. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Greg closed the door, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. Not running, not chasing, just driving forward, leaving the storm behind because he'd learned how to weather it. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone with his regrets. He was alone with his freedom. If you made it this far, thank you for riding this storm with Greg. If you want more raw, real stories that hit you where it hurts and heals, make sure you hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts below. Until the next confession,